I'll start. I'm Patricia Morris, and for the next 7 days, I get to be the immediate past president of FASEB. I'm a member of 4 or 5 FASEB societies. I represent Society for the Study of Reproduction on the board come July. I'm at the Rockefeller University in New York, and my area is molecular biology of RNA and gene expression. And since the vice chair, I'm also chair of this LDC committee for the next 7 days. And so why don't we, since Lou will be joining us late, Sally?
Lou is not going to be joining us today. Marcelo is going to be joining us late.
Okay, so Tom Clemens, why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay. Hi, everybody. Tom Clemens. I'm the treasurer-elect for FASEB. I represent the American Society for Bone and Mineral Research. I'm at the University of Maryland Department of Orthopedics, and I study basically musculoskeletal diseases, specifically related to the cells of these organs, and trying to identify anabolic targets using genetic approaches.
Thank you. Patrick?
Hey everyone, I'm Patrick Pagano. I'm at the University of Pittsburgh, faculty member in the Department of Pharmacology and Chemical Biology, and have my lab in the Vascular Medicine Institute, which has been my career interest. I work on the phenotypic effects of NADPH oxidases in vascular remodeling and various diseases.
And Lauren, who is our vice president-elect for DEAI.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lauren Walker. I used to, as of 3 weeks ago, be a postdoc at Rutgers University. As of right now, I am a research scientist toxicologist at Colgate-Palmolive, and I'm representing the American Association of Immunologists.
Thank you, and congratulations to all of you for being elected by your society to participate in FASEB's activities. Tom, welcome to the Finance Committee. We look forward to it. And importantly, are the staff members, and I'll ask Frank to introduce himself. On mute, yeah.
Hi, everyone. Frank Kraus, Executive Director and CEO for FASEB. I've been here for a little over 6 years now, so I'm looking forward to talking with you about the important work of the board, and look forward to getting to know you and engage all of you in some challenging work over the next few years.
Sally?
And I'm Sally Schwetman. I am the Governance and Leadership Development Director at FASEB. So that means that I handle a lot of the logistics for the board, and also am in charge of facilitating these onboarding sessions, as well as a lot of other things.
Thanks. So Maribeth.
Hi everyone, Mary Bedford. I work with Sally and Frank and many others. Great to meet you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's get underway. Sally, can you move to the first slide? Okay, so I've already said congratulations to all of you, and I think you can look forward to not only participatory input, but also learning a lot from the expert staff. No matter what stage in your career you are, FASEB presents such a wonderful collegial environment for everyone to promote and to agree or disagree with collaborative type of discussions on new initiatives, as well as FASEB's advocacy and science policy. So with no further ado, these are all the questions, no matter how experienced you are. It's a refresher on this onboarding of what exactly is FASEB, what is my role on the board, and how do all the pieces of the puzzle fit together. Next slide, Sally. So these are all the board responsibilities of really any nonprofit board of directors. And this onboarding program is actually intended to provide the background and the context framework that you need to fulfill and participate in these responsibilities. So firstly is FASEB's overall welfare, the sufficiency of revenue, organizational excellence, ethics and organizational policy. Hopefully, we don't have to do CEO hiring and evaluation, but that is definitely one of our roles on the board, and legal compliance with regulations. Next. So on to our first session, which would be the FASEB overview, and part 2, which will take place on Tuesday. We'll go over the board duties, and on session 3, which will be next Thursday, we will be reviewing the best practices and engagement. Next slide. So Federation overview. So the agenda is FASEB governance and staffing, its mission, the strategic plan and major initiatives, the major cornerstone programs, public affairs, diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, DEAI, and DataWorks, and operation and financials. Next slide. So at the moment, we have 26 federation societies, and these societies that range in size from 10,000 up to several hundred members, representing over 110,000 scientists involved in biological and biomedical research. Next slide. So FASEB's history is each dot is one member society, and you can see if you look on the far left of the graph, all the founding societies, the 4 societies that founded FASEB. And originally FASEB was designed to hold annual meetings and publications, and with the 1940s came 2 more, and then you see that once the focus of FASEB really moved to advocacy and public affairs, this led to many more societies in the period from the 90s to the present, of societies with an emphasis on our legislative affairs and science policy. So we'll now move on to a comprehensive century of service and advocacy. And I think as you join the board in whichever role Lauren has as a vice president also elect, that really the reference and the touchstone is the founding principles of FASEB. And we do have a book that several of our really highly recognized scientists over the years put together, a compilation of our history, and Howard Garrison, who directed and really set up the Office of Public Affairs, and 2 of the past presidents of FASEB authored this book, and that's available for purchase. So I'll now turn it over to Frank.
Hi, everyone. Just a couple of slides to orient you formally to FASEB. So FASEB is a nonprofit. We are a 501c3, which means we operate primarily for an educational benefit, although we are allowed to do some lobbying and extensive advocacy as part of that program. Excuse me. As Patricia mentioned, in terms of the society, we have 26 member societies. Note, though, that each society has their own structure in terms of individual and other membership types. So their structure does not impact FASEB's. We'll talk about that as well as in a little bit. So as a nonprofit corporation, we have employees. I'm one of them. We own property. And we also engage in different lines of business, which you'll learn more about today. And finally, I do want to note that nonprofit does not mean no profit, right? Nonprofit is a tax designation. It's not a business strategy. In order for the Federation to continue to operate, we need to be financially stable in the short term and over the long term. And again, later you'll learn about new programs and new concepts that we're exploring to ensure FASEB is able to continue to deliver on its mission and its policy and advocacy work over the long term. Next. So I mentioned the two membership types earlier. Here you see them on the screen. Full members are basically very active members in the society. If you are on the board or in one of these appointed roles, you are a member of a full member society. You have representation on the FASEB board, the Science Policy Committee, and the full members are really the engine that makes FASEB what it is. Provides us with the stellar science policy position statements and responses to RFIs that really set FASEB at the top of the pyramid in terms of biological and biomedical advocacy organizations. The associate membership is a bit more of a passive membership. The society's name and the society's influence is added to FASEBs to amplify the overall voice, but associate members do not participate in the Science Policy Committee or the Board of Directors. They're basically a more passive player in the ecosystem, if you will. They also pay significantly lower dues as a result of their associate membership status. Next slide, back to Patricia.
Okay, so we're now going to move to the Board of Directors, and this slide will really describe who you see at the board meetings, and each full member appoints one director who is a voting member of the board, and 3 voting seats on the board are reserved for early career stage representatives. And these individuals are nominated by their society, but appointed to the board. And we've had wonderful success with the recent early career stage representatives. They've been very participatory and engaged in the responsibilities and board activities. So Frank, as FASEB's executive director and CEO, also serves as the Federation's secretary, and you can see that he's a non-voting member. In addition to the board members, you will often see at the board meetings that FASEB senior staff attend. Society executive officers are invited to attend the meetings or part of the meetings, depending upon what is to be discussed. Society public affairs staff, and as appropriate and when required, either the committees or a task force leadership may be invited to attend as well. Next slide. So here are the faces that you will see. Some of you are already familiar with most of them. Marianne Bjornstein will become president on July 1st. And the immediate past president, who is our current president, is Kevin Kriegel. And Beth Garvey will step into the president-elect role. So we have a vice president for science policy, Eric Kelly. And you can see there, vice president for DEAI, which is our newest leadership position, Marcello Bonini, who hasn't joined yet for the call and the onboarding, will be our vice president for DEAI, and Lauren, as I mentioned before, is our vice president-elect for DEAI. And so we have board representatives from each of the societies. Next slide. You could see Tom on that slide too. I'm sorry, Tom. I kind of passed by too quickly. Okay, so this slide really describes our governance structure. And Sally is our Director of Governance. I got that right, Sally, I hope. And she keeps us all in line, I can assure you, informed and well armed to do the business of the Board of Directors. So the board itself does not do all and be all, but does get final approval on FASEB business, property, and programs. Uh-oh, one too fast. So the executive committee is elected from the board. There are 2 representatives elected as board of directors and also the leadership. And as I said, there are short-term task forces, and they're usually charged with a very specific and achievable set of priorities within a time frame. And the committees are charged with addressing ongoing objectives, and they have subcommittees as needed. Next slide. Okay, so the active committees and task forces, I've mentioned the executive committee, DEAI, the Executive Officers Advisory Committee, the Finance Committee, Tom, Science Policy, not defined by the bylaws, are the Audit Committee, the Advisory Board for the Advisory Committee for DataWorks, Development, Excellence in Science Award, the Howard Garrison Award, which is now engaged in selecting new fellows and awardees for a science policy fellowship, leadership development, meetings, membership, protection of human subjects, and publications. And for example, of a task force, the Future Focus Task Force. Next slide. Okay, so now on to mission, strategic plan, and major objectives. Okay, so we have this in front of us at each of the board meetings. Importantly, and perhaps the jewel in the crown of FASEB are the public affairs and science policy efforts, which is really spearheaded by our excellent team of experts in this area. Research and education to advance that in the biological and biomedical spheres, to work with the public and to enhance the talent pool of a diversified and fully trained workforce, and ultimately to have an organization that achieves the desired excellence that has been set as our mission all these years. Next. Frank, I'm sorry, I didn't.
That's okay, Patricia, you did a good job. So as Patricia noted, the board often forms task forces to help with specific work that it identifies as necessary. For 2023, there is one single task force, the Future Focus Task Force. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on in this presentation. But this task force is focused on identifying a long-term operational and financial model that will allow FASEB to continue to meet its mission of serving science and humanity while also remaining stable financially. So more to come on this one. Next slide. Patricia.
Yep. Okay, so now on to some of the programs. We'll move on to the major programmatic areas. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, really public affairs is the heart and soul of FASEB. And this is really directly involved with priority. You see it right at the top of our strategic plan. So our advocacy efforts in science policy and federal legislation are really cited consistently and actually sought out by federal and state agencies for the expertise, as well as many of our societies, some of whom have their own public affairs or public outreach, but they really still have a infrastructure at FASEB that really augments their own activities, perhaps in a much more restricted field that they hold. Next slide. Okay, so Jennifer Zeitzer. So Jennifer Zeitzer is the director of the Office of Public Affairs, and she is the overall director of not only legislative affairs, but also science policy. Next slide. Okay, a busy slide, but this is just to give you the flavor of what the legislative affairs does in terms of an annual federal budget timeline. And you can imagine how challenging this is for the staff of OPA because of the state of affairs at our congressional level. But you'll find, for those of you who are not already familiar with OPA, that they stay very much on the pulse. And we have actually consultants who enable us to keep up with the goings on in the legislature and Congress in particular. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about science policy. So our Eric Kelly is the Vice President for Science Policy, and he will assume that role as of, he'll step out of his elect role and into his full role on July 1st. Mike Lehman is the Vice President-elect, and Naomi Shalom-Bacchus is the Associate Director of Science Policy. Next slide. So how do we develop policy statements? So an issue is identified, and this can be brought up by anybody on the board or the staff, and that issue is identified, and staff and volunteers can bring that forward. We usually have an open mic where people can bring up new ideas as well. The staff and the volunteers together collaborate on an action plan. The deliberation and development is seated in the science policy, and science policy will endorse a review and bring it forward at a monthly SPC, Science Policy Committee meeting. When it's ready for prime time, it will go to the board for their consideration, and Eric will be presenting the statement and briefs the board on the process to achieve that. And then there'll be dissemination once the board has approved. Next slide. So a few advocacy examples. All of you perhaps are familiar. If not, please go to the webpage and you can see the 15 most recent fact sheets related to both animal research and the workforce. And historically, FASEB has always been very much engaged in regulatory input to federal agencies. Recently, there was an animal research day on Congress and Capitol Hill. There were 16 meetings with 13 FASEB volunteers. And there was a briefing to Congress of the representatives and a senator at Congress on animal research. And all of these are to counter activism of animal research and disinformation. And we really appreciate the early career representatives being very much engaged in this particular initiative. Next slide. Okay, so I gotta look down and see if this is mine. I think it is. Okay, so the next one is diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. Next slide. Okay, so research and education and the building of the next generation and the enhancement and augmentation of the current workforce and graduate students who are about to become early stage investigators by engaging with the member societies and really advancing initiatives. But one of the things that you'll find, if you don't know already, is that FASEB is very solidly based on scholarly research to provide evidence and data and metrics in order to give agencies the ability to base future initiatives. Next slide. Okay, so again, Marcelo is the DEAI new vice president. Lauren is the vice president-elect, and the staff, our expert staff, is Yvette Seeger, who is the director of strategic scientific initiatives, LV Bandy, who is the program manager for DEAI, and our Mary Beth is the governance and the coordinator for the DEI activities. Next slide. Okay, so the current DEAI programs and initiatives are CARES, and that's the excellent in career advancement and research excellence support, and FASEB leadership engagement and appreciation of differences, which is LEAD. Next slide. DataWorks. Okay. So what are the components of DataWorks? I'm not up to Frank yet, right? Okay, Salon is a conversational space for the community to exchange ideas and design effective practices. And we recently hired the help desk manager to provide guidance for the community who now, since January, have to navigate and adopt data sharing and reuse policies and practices. And we've been fortunate to partner with the NIH to be able to give DataWorks prizes, which really acknowledges research teams that have integrated data sharing and reuse to advance human health and use those teams as models for the community to follow. Next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, the DataWorks staff is headed by Yvette Seeger, who is the Director of Strategic Initiatives. You'll notice that Yvette wears many hats. Stephanie Hagstrom, who's the DataWorks Program Manager, and Emily Ruff, who's the Community Manager. Next slide. Okay, the operations and financials. Okay, this is Frank, I know. Okay, Frank.
It is. Thanks, Patricia. So here's a picture of FASEB's headquarters. Our offices are located in Rockville, Maryland at 6120 Executive Boulevard, as are 6 FASEB member societies. So we've got a lot of great company there in this building, which allows for some good interactions. However, we are in a remote first work environment. It's something our staff excelled at during the pandemic, and we have maintained that approach. So in moving into this new office space, we have a very open and flexible layout. The main portion of the office is completely open and can be configured as needed for various activities. So we have department team meetings, we have packing meetings for our science research conferences. We recently hosted the board for a lunch with staff in that space. We had a board dinner in that space during the June meeting. So the intent is to make it flexible and welcoming. And one thing that I've noted with the executive officers is if they want to have a small committee or board meeting, that space is available for them to use. as well, and we'll facilitate as best we can. Next slide. So not going to go through every box on this slide, so don't worry about that if you can't quite see it. But I can assure you with no humility, quite honestly, that we have an exceptional staff working at FASEB. They're extremely dedicated to this organization and are all-stars in each of their respective areas. And I think you've seen some of that today just with the work that Sally's been doing. I expect you will continue to see that throughout your tenure on the board with FASEB. And this structure continues to evolve to meet the needs of the organization. Next slide. So how does FASEB work? How do we operate? Well, how do we make any money? I mentioned the nonprofit is not a business strategy earlier. So our largest contributor of margin or funding for the organization comes from publications. FASEB has one main journal, the FASEB Journal, which has been around for almost 50 years now, near the top of its various classification categories. We have a fledgling open access journal called FASEB Bio Advances that will be getting its impact factor, its first impact factor very soon, and we have high hopes for that journal. We also receive about 7% of our revenues from membership dues. Those are dues paid by those full member societies that I mentioned earlier, as well as the associate members' science research conferences. This is a portfolio of about 75 smaller conferences of 100 to 200 people each that are held basically every 2 years. So we go through a cycle on those science research conferences. They generate the most revenue, but they don't generate the most margin to fund the rest of the organization. You'll learn more about that as the board moves forward. And then finally, we also offer human resources, benefits, payroll, and retirement plan support for 12 societies. So we pull together those resources to provide a more effective benefits package and solution. And then we also offer accounting services through our accounting partner, Markham, which does FASEB's accounting work. Next slide. So I kind of hinted at some of the contribution areas here or earlier in the last slide. Here you see the revenue components as a chart here from 2019 through 2023. So I'll point out a couple of items here. Here you see the science research conferences. So you see in 2019, the science research conferences were generating almost $2 million in margin $6 million of revenue to the organization. And then the pandemic hit and all that revenue went away. 2020, almost all of it in 2021. 2022 is a big year where we rebounded, and 2023 is kind of in between. So you see the impacts of the pandemic there. Again, dues you see, they're the smallest revenue component for FASEB. Membership is critical. It's what makes FASEB work. But from a financial contribution, it's the smallest component for us. And then you see the contribution from pubs, which has been a bit up and down over the last several years as research output has grown and shrank. And finally, then the society management services, which is a small component, but a critical value for the member societies that participate in it. Next slide. Next, I'll go a little bit further into the Future Focus Task Force. So I mentioned this briefly earlier. This will be by far the most important and engaging area that you will be involved in as a board member throughout the rest of 2023, possibly or hopefully into 2024 as well. As I mentioned earlier, the Future Focus Task Force is looking at what the future could be, not just for FASEB, but for science societies overall. And there's a tremendous amount of work that's been put into that. You're going to learn more about that during the July board meeting. But the task force has been working for the first 6 months of the year to explore different concepts or pathways that FASEB could pursue for its future, and is now at the point that we've developed a new concept organization that is significantly different than anything the biological and biomedical sciences community has seen before. Next slide. We're now at the point of developing that concept further, socializing it with member and non-member societies to get feedback on the model. We'll be refining that model over the next several months and looking for early adopters, societies that are interested in participating further in the development of this concept, leading to business cases and financial modeling that will be presented to the board at the December meeting, which will be an in-person meeting held in Rockville, for a decision whether or not to proceed with concept implementation or to sunset the new concept. 2024 then would be a full year of transition, and actually that transition would continue for several years. And then finally, we have on this call Tom Clemens, the treasurer-elect. Tom is one of the additional people being added to this task force, and we just had that expanded task force meeting earlier today. So we're growing our reach of the task force to ensure we have the right people at the table in discussing this concept, representing the breadth of science that FASEB represents. Next slide. That is it. Open discussion now. Patricia?
Any questions, please? And thank you for mentioning that Tom is, I neglected, and importantly, that Tom Clemens is our treasurer-elect, and he will be working with Cherie Butts to keep us on point with our finances, as well as joining, as Frank just mentioned, the future task force. So as a reminder, our next onboarding is on Tuesday, June 27th at 11 a.m. Eastern time. So please ask your questions if you have any. If I've confused any of the elements, please correct me, Sally.
I don't think so. I would stress that Tuesday is really, really, really important, because Tuesday is when we're going to really dive into the fiduciary responsibilities of being a board member. So today was really intended to just get everybody on the same page with what is FASEB, what do we do, where can you go to find more information about something. But Tuesday is probably our most critical part of this onboarding, where we'll really get into what does it mean to be a FASEB board member. And also, because FASEB directors are appointed by their society, it can get a little tricky because you're a representative of your society, but you're a fiduciary for FASEB. So we'll talk more about that in session 2. And then next Thursday in session 3, it will be much more focused on, well, what do I do as a board member? Like, how do I get agenda materials? What are some best practices? How should I interact with my society? Where can I get more information if I'm confused? How do I interact with staff? That sort of thing will be on Thursday.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So I was wondering what challenges or benefits, if any, the dissolution of EB was to FASEB. I assume there was a financial linkage still after all these years. So I'm wondering what challenges that might pose, and is the demand for smaller conferences greater now?
Frank, you want to?
Sure, I can handle that. So Patrick, for the last 30 years, for the entirety of the experimental biology meeting, FASEB acted as the management organization for the meeting. FASEB was not the organizer of the meeting. We were a service provider. From that perspective, the meeting provided a significant amount of revenue to FASEB, about $700,000 per year. However, the margin from that, the surplus revenue, if you will, was very limited as a result of the contracts that we that we had. So overall, it wasn't a significant bottom line financial impact for FASEB. However, we do feel it was a significant negative impact for the community to not have a broad transdisciplinary meeting available for scientists. As part of the work of the Future Focus Task Force and the new organization concept, you'll hear more about this. And we are in the early stages of fielding a survey to learn whether or not there's interest in a broad, large-scale transdisciplinary meeting moving forward, or is the preference for these smaller meetings, or perhaps it's a mix of both. So you're going to learn more about that as we move forward. But I can assure you that the dissolution of the experimental biology meeting was not a FASEB decision in any way.
Okay, and I guess we can discuss another time what the major reason for the dissolution was, because I'm not sure.
You'll be hearing more about that as part of the Future Focus Task Force work, and I'm actually glad you brought that up because it gives me a chance to say I was remiss in not mentioning earlier. The Future Focus Task Force and the new organization concept that is being proposed is complex. It is significantly different than anything today's biomedical, biological research societies are used to. It will take some time to understand. The meeting on July 11th, the first board meeting you will attend, goes through some of the background associated with it. We're continuing to educate the board members who have been here throughout the entire process. You'll get a good opportunity to get that background there in early July. And then we're going to offer an additional session for new board members just for the Future Focus Task Force work. So kind of a fourth orientation, if you will. So for those that are interested in have a lot of questions, we're going to give you another opportunity to engage there.
Excellent. Thank you, Frank.
Any other questions? Well, hearing none, I certainly appreciate your volunteerism. Welcome you again to whatever roles. I don't see time, but welcome both Patrick and Lauren to their roles supporting FASEB and helping us evolve further in our mission and mandate. So see you all next Tuesday, the 27th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Next
Bye.
week.